of Ottomans.
The story of Aleppo from the 16th century to today. We'll have a column from Mary Russell. Also,
people were very class conscious. Tuppence halfpenny looking down on tuppence.
You didn't talk about family planning, you know. That was just taboo.
we'll be revisiting the 1950s, the decade when Ireland pivoted away from isolation and looked outwards. Our text number is 51551. The email is history@rte.ie, and you can find us on Twitter @RTE History Show.
And that is all for this time, ladies and gentlemen. Your next dance, please.
Let's remind ourselves of life here in the 1950s. Here's one cinema owner reporting the scandalous behaviour that accompanied the arrival of the film Rock Around the Clock in 1956.
It took, I think, about 5 minutes for that crowd to change from being a very good-humoured lot into a collection of blackguards. And of course they were all very sorry the following day, and they were all back to apologise, but that didn't remedy the damage that had been done.
The dancehalls too were guarding against dangerous new youth culture.
I was thrown out of another dance hall for doing the Charleston. I was told I was jiving in it. And, well, as far as I was concerned, it wasn't jive. It was only just doing the Charleston down there, as I was taught it. Mm-hmm. And, of course, they come along and they said, oh, Charleston, not at all. That's not Charleston. He says, that's jive.
Well, how about rock and roll? Do you think it's here to stay?
I think it is. And it'll catch on, and it'll catch on fast.
Brendan Behan had made his international breakthrough, but there was embarrassment at home about him appearing drunk on a TV show in the UK.
What about people now? You told me earlier today that somebody phoned you up after that and said that you had been a disgrace to Ireland and let Ireland down by doing this because you're an Irishman. What was your reaction to that?
I was foolish enough to be somewhat upset by that. But then I met more sensible people. I mean, I wasn't a criminal. I mean, I hadn't forced 40,000 Irish to leave the island inside of 1 year.
And Dublin's last remaining tramway on the Hill of Howth ground to a halt.
But it's pulling to a stop at this moment. There is the inn. Progress has come to the summit. And the old Howth tram had to go.
All right, well, that was the end of an era, and this evening we're taking a closer look at the 1950s, the decade during which emigration reached levels so devastating that the very existence of the state was considered to be under threat. It was the decade during which Ireland pivoted away from cultural and economic isolationism and turned outwards. So who were the people, who were the forces that made change possible? I'm joined by UCC sociologist Niamh Howrican and by historian Kate O'Malley, who was the assistant editor of documents on Irish foreign policy 1951 to 1957, volume 10, I think, in the series, am I right, Kate, which was published on Thursday. Now, the 1950s, Niamh, a decade of two halves, both in terms of foreign policy, which Kate will talk about, and in terms of how Ireland was as a society. Paint a picture of Ireland's domestic situation in the early 1950s.
I think the best place to start, actually, the theme that kind of transcends both halves of the decade really is with Behan's quote there about immigration. He talked about 40,000 people leaving every year. In 1957, 54,000 people left Ireland. It's estimated that, and a bit like austerity now, there was particular generations that were most affected by this. It's estimated that something like 4 out of every 5 children born in the 1930s actually emigrated in the 1950s. So the scale of emigration, I suppose, really in the early stages of the 1950s, what you're seeing is this tremendous stagnation, because you have a flight, particularly from rural Ireland, particularly from the western seaboard, and with that flight, with the young people, go energy, ideas, creativity. There's an absolutely brilliant quote from Anthony Cronin from the Bell in 1953, which says, "We must look outward again or die, if only from boredom." There's that sense of this kind of stultifying atmosphere. But even at that point, Myles, I think it's important to recognise that there were chips happening. I mean, there was a number of face-offs between the church and the state, or the church and the society, throughout the 1950s, really starting with the Mother and Child Scheme in 1951. And while, you know, at the surface level, it appeared that, you know, that the church was winning those and the stagnation was continuing, actually, I would argue that chips were being made.
So it wasn't monolithic.
It wasn't indeed. And, you know, there's a lot, if we look at kind of contemporary history, there's a lot of celebration of the 60s, and particularly the period from 1958 onwards, and the kind of big changes that Lamass and Whitaker brought. But actually, you can trace back and start to see some of those changes coming in earlier, both even in terms of economic change and some of the kind of agreements that happened, kind of trade agreements that happened in the 50s that were the start of this outward orientation, and also culturally. I mean, if we look at things like theatre was an extraordinary place of challenge, really, in the 50s, in a society that was otherwise, I suppose, quite consensual.
But you have to say that in the early 50s, at least, we were talking here about a failed state.
There's a tremendous sense of a society in the 1950s that's really uncertain, that comes out of World War II and the emergency with a massive crisis. It's almost like this road was taken during World War II, the road of neutrality. There was a whole load of consequences of that. And the consequence of that then is, oh my God, where are we? So, you know, you have 4 changes of government between 1948 and 1957. And it's kind of, who are we now? Where are we now? Now, many would argue that does actually get figured out in the end, and by the late 50s, early 60s, but it takes a long time, and you have a tremendous sense of soul searching throughout this decade.
Well, we'll talk about the consequences of neutrality with Kate in a few minutes, but what about education? Education obviously became very important in the 1960s. We talked a couple of weeks back about Donogh O'Malley's free secondary education, which comes in, but education in the 1950s, was it for the few?
Well, it was still, I mean, it was in some ways still carrying on the legacies of the structures that had been started in the kind of Free State period. One of the things that starts to become evident is the real failure of the kind of policy of revitalising the language through the school system. Do you know what I mean? And that both has an effect on the school system itself, but actually it also has an effect on the Irish language movement. And you can see changes again in the 1960s coming into the Irish language movement as a recognition that just this position of making the language the kind of official part of the state is not efficient there. But again, one of the huge, I suppose, tragedies and failures of this period is that so many of the people who left with relatively low levels of education, and it was really hard. And I suppose this is when we look at, say, the period of emigration in the mid-1980s, one of the tremendous differences between that and the 50s period was the level of education of people who graduated in the 80s, and the way in which that really not only changed their experience when they left, but actually made it much more easy for them to return subsequently.
Okay, let's listen to people who lived through it before we talk to Kate on foreign policy. Francis Shanahan has been talking to people in Waterford who have vivid memories of the 1950s. Tom Dowling was a teacher in Mount Sion National School. Sean O'Brien worked in the post office, and Mary McNamara worked in an office before she got married.
Well, we had big classes. Of course, 6th class in the primary at that time, you would have 45 to 50 pupils in it. Of course, they had to stay until they were 14. They didn't all go on to the secondary. Money was very tight with people. 9 and 10 in a family wasn't at all unusual back then. If you didn't have secondary education, you just took the boat to England. And I remember having a class in Mount Sion and asking the boys about how many studies were over, and there were more than 50% of the class.
They were sending home money from England, especially London, and particularly Cricklewood, I remember, for some reason. And that came usually by telegraph money order on Friday, or by registered letter on Monday or Tuesday. Well, people were literally waiting for it, because things were dire at that time.
If you were left a widow, you had nothing. You had no help, no widow's pension, and the poor women had to go out and work. People were very class conscious, as they used to say, tuppence halfpenny looking down on tuppence. It's amazing the way people now, no matter what class they are, they all mix.
Yeah, there was certainly class distinction. That was very evident. The big farmers and professional people were certainly way above the rest.
You daren't talk about family planning, or anything to do with contraception. That was just taboo. We didn't even know these things existed.
That was Tom Dowling, Sean O'Brien and Mary McNamara in Waterford speaking there to Francis Shanahan. Kate, we had remained neutral during the Second World War. That must have had consequences for our foreign policy in the 1950s.
Absolutely, it did undoubtedly. The early to mid-1950s were an uncertain time for Irish foreign policy, and we had increased growing isolation, achieved both by accident and by design, it must be said. We mustn't forget that the first inter-party government took us unexpectedly out of the Commonwealth. So the only international organisation with which we had any dealings post-war, we were no longer a member of by the early to mid 1950s. So we were effectively cut off from all avenues of diplomatic activity. So the first part of the 50s for our volume of documents, which covers 51 to 57, is really a low point in Irish foreign policy. We're almost reduced to just looking at Anglo-Irish relations and obviously the sort of partition and little else. And then the second half of our volume sees our foreign policy broaden out dramatically and suddenly when we joined the UN. But I mean, some of this isolation is illustrated in a few of our documents, and Niamh alluded to this kind of claustrophobic attitude and atmosphere. And there's a really interesting document from Maurice Moynihan from 1956, who was then Cabinet Secretary. And if you think about it, he's looking at kind of the lead up to the Treaty of Rome of 1957. And in a cabinet memo, he starts describing concerns about the establishment of a free trade area. And were Britain to join this free trade area in Western Europe, and we weren't, that we would be shutting off the windows onto the Western world as we know it, the world with which culturally, historically, we belong to. And that this atmosphere then would become so claustrophobic and stifling that we would witness emigration, the likes of which we haven't seen since the famine. In a really weird way, that's kind of like a flipped Brexit when you think about it, when you're looking at how concerned he was about us not being involved in Europe. Obviously, we didn't get involved in Europe until Lamass became Taoiseach in 59, and efforts got underway then. So the 50s really are, this first part in particular, we really are isolated and are not joining NATO. Neutrality and the hangover of both those things are very apparent.
And how much do we really care about those emigrants that Niamh was talking about, who are now in Birmingham, who are now in Liverpool, who are now in London, in terms of foreign policy and in terms of foreign policy documentation?
We care enough to take great note, and our ambassador, who was in Britain in the first half of the 1950s, was a very well-known figure at the time, Freddie Boland. Very well-known household name at the time, probably not so much now, but Freddie Boland, before he went to the UN, was our ambassador in London. And throughout the early part of the 50s, reports, kind of anecdotal reports initially, then newspaper reports start coming down from about stories of the Irish immigrants that were arriving in Birmingham and Coventry, these post-Second World War blitzed cities. So much recovery was going on there, building, and munitions factories, that there was a lot of employment there for Irish people. And so it's estimated at this particular time there's about 50,000 Irish people there, and the accommodation is absolutely appalling, and circumstances there are clearly not ideal. So what they do is they actually enlist the help of a chap called Maurice Foley, who worked for the Young Christian Worker Association. He was a son of an immigrant himself, an Irish immigrant himself, and actually went on under Harold Wilson to become Under Secretary of State with responsibility for welfare of immigrants during that time in Britain in the 50s and 60s, when there was a huge rash of Commonwealth emigration from the West Indies and from India and Pakistan. So initially in the early 50s, we solicit his help to actually go up and report on the circumstances that these Irish immigrants are in up there. And it's not a pretty sight at all. He says that, they're grossly overcrowded, ill-kept, dirty, cost exorbitant. But towards the end of his reports, we get to the crux of the issue. There's a lot of drinking going on. And in some of these pubs, there's an enlistment for the Conley Association going on. So we get this beginning of this concerns about politicisation of these young Irish men and about the activities of some of the younger Irish women there too. In the context of our relationship then with the USA, we have found out in the last week or 2 weeks that there will be Shamrock in the Trump White House. That's a tremendous relief to all of us, I'm sure.
But the traditional presentation of Shamrock to the US president wasn't always traditional.
No, it actually began with a very well-known to people who are interested in Irish diplomatic history, a figure called John J. Hearn, who was actually the architect of the Irish Constitution in 1937 and legal advisor to the department then. He went on to become ambassador or High Commissioner to Canada and then ambassador to the States. And it was Hearn's idea to begin presenting kind of little boxes of Shamrock, actually, I think initially to congressmen, and eventually then diplomats, initially it was ambassadors, presented boxes of Shamrock to officials, right? But then during Hearn's time in 1952, the ante was upped and they decided to place some of the Shamrock into a Waterford crystal bowl, and then eventually it became formalised when, with the visit of John A. Costello in 56 during St. Patrick's Day, the formalisation of this process again, and obviously it's been a huge coup for us ever since. But yeah, it was just an idea of John Hearn's at the time to try and engage with some of the people on Capitol Hill better than we had done in the post-war period.
Something that they wouldn't have been too keen on in the USA was the fact that in London that Irish diplomats were being approached by Soviet agents or Soviet diplomats. I mean, what will we call them? Will we call them agents or will we call them diplomats? What was actually going on there?
You can call them men of many talents, I suppose. There was a kind of a unexpected interest in some of our junior diplomatic staff in the London embassy, interest being paid by the Soviet a diplomat there called Rodionov, and he got in touch with Jack Malloy, who was our first secretary when Boland was there, and started asking him to meet for lunch dates and dinners and whatnot. And look, the purpose of this was really, it didn't escape Boland's attention, and he effectively said that, he agreed with Jack that he should accept this invitation, but that he should be fully alive to the fact that this cordiality is not likely to be without some object, and also that his contacts, Boland, very astute, was aware that they hadn't escaped the attention of the Cloak and Dagger boys here, as in MI5. So he took him to a few restaurants in Soho, under the guise of being interested in, society in Ireland, but really he was, having similar meetings with all of the other kind of Western
no such thing as a free coffee.
Absolutely not.
Sounds a lot more exciting Dublin at the time, in fairness.
But I mean, to give you an idea of how ineffective he was, he actually said to Jack Malloy, I don't want to try and get any secrets out of you, and he reported this back to Dublin. Malloy was very concerned that he wouldn't get into any trouble because of this, and obviously instructions had been sent out. Look, don't be discourteous, but really let's not liaise with them too much.
Yeah, but listen to whatever the man has to say.
Yeah.
Niamh, now you were talking earlier about the artificial cohesiveness and in reality the stagnation of Ireland in the 1950s. What can you see a turning point? Is it somewhere in the middle of the decade that things begin to get better? I know you're talking about the fact that it was being chipped away at, but in terms of substantive change,
if you look at the situation culturally, I suppose there's very interesting debates around censorship starting to emerge in the latter half of the decade, and there is this legal case around Alan Simpson's play The Rose Tattoo, which highlights some of the kind of broader tensions culturally about the role of the church in kind of censorship. But I mean, it's very important to recognise, Myles, between 1940 and 1965, 34 churches were built in Dublin and 26 new parishes were formed. So, even though there is in the latter half of the 1950s a kind of an opening up and an outward orientation, many people would argue that one of Lemass's successes in terms of, I suppose, modernisation was he managed to decouple the idea of modernisation from Anglicisation. Do you know what I mean? And that particularly in the urban centres, you saw a continuation of very high levels of religious practice, for instance, with an increasing outward orientation. And it's very interesting to look at Lemass and some of the statements he makes and his conviction about the fact that Irish workers in particular could adapt to the challenges of globalisation. That was kind of, in hindsight now we're in a kind of a period of crisis of globalisation, but it was very affirming, I think, for Irish workers at the time to hear what Lemass had to say about that.
But it's interesting. There's an axiom: the price of freedom is eternal vigilance. In Ireland, was it the case that the price of freedom was eternal frugality. You've written yourself about this notion that De Valera had, that Ireland had been a servant in the big mansion and had now thrown off the shackles of the big mansion, but had to take the consequences, and the consequences were living in a small cottage.
That's it, and De Valera celebrated that. But of course, by the late 1950s, and you had it there in the excerpts at the very beginning of the piece, you had global culture coming into Ireland, showing people what was going on outside, and people were no longer willing to accept that frugality, and they were voting with their feet. And there are some great quotes in 1957-58 where very senior people within the state, in academia, in the civil service and in politics recognise the state is actually running out of road. That national project of establishing a state may no longer be viable if people continue to leave. And T.K. Whitaker himself, of course, would have said, that was the inspiration for the route he took around economic development. And that was the moment of realisation that something has to be done, or else we are in serious trouble here with the project.
Kate, you mentioned that we abandoned the only multinational organisation that we were involved in 1949, i.e. the Commonwealth, and we didn't get in to the United Nations until 1955. Why did it take so long to get into the UN, and was it any kind of a turning point when we did?
Very simple answers to your first question was a Soviet veto, which had been in place since the immediate post-war period.
Why did they not like us, Kate?
It wasn't just us. There were 16 people that were let in. We weren't the only ones. So we joined at the same time. There was a deal, effectively a package deal done with the Soviets. And interestingly, given another kind of Commonwealth connection with some help from our Canadian counterparts who kept us filled in great detail. And we obviously have a great history of good collaboration with the Canadians from the 1920s period in the imperial conferences. And it seems not just the Canadians but other Commonwealth members were deeply upset at the fact that we didn't remain in the Commonwealth. So when we joined the UN, you can really see just our foreign policy just changing overnight, really. All of a sudden, the world stage diplomatically is open to us. You can almost even see as well on the part of some of the diplomats and of course that very first famous delegation which had Conor Cruise O'Brien, Eamon Kennedy, and one of our few female diplomats at the time, Sheila Murphy, on board, and of course Liam Cosgrave, who was incredibly young, 34 when he became minister and 36 when he gave his maiden speech at the UN. You can almost see on their memos and on their letters home, their mindset changing when they realised all of a sudden they were able to engage with these leaders and statesmen from which we had really had no engagement since the wartime period.
Because prior to that, I think Frank Aiken, who was Minister for External Affairs for about 10,000 years, his preoccupation was partition.
Absolutely. And not least because there was not much else we could do, as isolated as we were. But the really interesting thing is that that first period of his time as Minister for External Affairs was something of a springboard, because when he became Minister in that second part, his successes at the UN were immense. So he did learn from that kind of period of isolation. But overnight, all of a sudden, and that first year, the 1956, really was a baptism of fire. We had, the Suez crisis, Hungary. All of a sudden, our junior diplomats had to learn at speed, and indeed they did. And we had a very successful first year at that UN, and are remembered for it.
Okay, well, let's listen. Let's go have a listen to some of the voices from that period. I've already mentioned Liam Cosgrave, a very young Minister for External Affairs. But first, this is John A. Costello, the Taoiseach, giving an interview at UN headquarters in New York shortly after we were admitted.
You've just had a tour of the building and a personally conducted one by Mr. Hammarskjöld. What is your impression of these headquarters and of the setting in which world affairs are played out in the United Nations?
Well, the building itself, of course, is very striking from the outside. Architecturally, it's very interesting. But the general impression that I got, that it was not a mere magnificent palace purporting to be a palace of peace, but that it was a building devoted to real, solid, earnest endeavour.
And of course, the year after Ireland became members of the UN, the Suez crisis erupted. And this is Liam Cosgrave speaking about the crisis at the UN General Assembly in 1956.
The true users of the canal are the ordinary men and women everywhere. who buy the tea or burn the oil that passes through the canal. Life will be a little harder for these people as long as the canal is blocked. Life is harder, for example, in my own country. The Irish people had no say in the events that led to the blocking of the canal, but now that the canal is blocked, they have to pay.
Well, we didn't get in until 1955, but within only a few years of joining the UN, Ireland's ambassador, Freddie Boland, you've heard him being mentioned already as our ambassador in London, was elected president of the General Assembly in 1960. This is Boland welcoming his election.
Excellencies, fellow delegates, may I say first, in a few words, how deeply and how sincerely I appreciate the honour you have done my country and myself by electing me to preside at this 15th session of the Assembly, and how profoundly grateful I am to all those delegations whose friendly support made my election possible.
Why did it happen so quickly? Within 5 years, Freddie Boland is the president of the General Assembly and is actually being, I think, mentioned as a possible Secretary General of the United Nations as well.
Yeah, he was indeed. He was mooted as a successor to Dag Hammarskjöld after he'd passed away. He was a really successful diplomat, it must be said. And during his time as ambassador in London, he, even though he was, essentially a Republican in the truest sense, he was also an Anglophile, and he courted the Commonwealth Office and various prime ministers very, very successfully. He was immensely successful at the UN, and I think the fact that he was, like I said, mooted as a potential Secretary General is to his credit, absolutely.
Let's finish on domestic, not so much domestic politics, but on one of the great civil servants, because somebody who had a huge impact and somebody who will in a couple of weeks be 100 years old and is very much still with us, T.K. Whitaker. Just talk about his importance, Niamh, at the end of the 1950s.
Well, legend has it that it is a cartoon in Dublin Opinion magazine of Kathleen Ní Houlihan in the middle of a midlife crisis, who says, "Have I a future? Has Ireland a future?" And this is one of the things that inspires T.K. Whitaker. And there's a huge debate about whether his version of what was essentially a kind of a Keynesian approach to rebuilding the economy, combined with an outward orientation with a role for the state and planning, how much him and Lamass actually kind of converged around that. But it's quite clear that you're looking at a very substantial shift. But there's no doubt in my mind, Myles, that the reason that Whitaker and Lamass were able to bring about this transformation and this change relatively quickly was because that realisation that the previous form of protectionism had run out of road was already dawning on people. Obviously, De Valera, resigns in 59 and moves out of that position, so that creates, a new and Lamass's style in terms of running cabinet and his willingness to, I suppose, recognise that trying new things maybe involves making mistakes, and that you are going to sometimes have dissent, and that is part of, I suppose, the freshness, the new air, the end of the stagnation, which you see then even in the popular media comments of Ireland in the early 60s, which, is only at the very early stages of this process, but you get this sense of freshness and a new era dawning, and there's no doubt that T.K. Whitaker played an enormous role for that, and we in the state have much to be grateful to him for.
Niamh Hourigan, UCC sociologist and historian Kate O'Malley, thank you very much indeed. And the 10th volume of Documents on Irish Foreign Policy is published by the Royal Irish Academy. Tom texted in to take issue with me. He says, "You do Frank Aiken a disservice by not mentioning his continual championing of the Tibetan cause at the UN." Well, I was actually talking about Frank Aiken in the context of before we became members of the UN. But thank you indeed, Tom, for pointing that out. I would not like to do Frank Aiken a disservice. A great servant of Ireland over the years. And some more comments. Change didn't really happen until Dev died, says one commentator. I think that's a little bit unfair. Change certainly happened after he went to the park. I don't think we had to wait until 1975 until he died for change to come. And also there was huge opposition from the Catholic Church to our opening of relations with the Soviet Union. So once again, thanks to Niamh and to Kate. After the break, Aleppo, but in happier times.